Burkina Faso has done something the world has never witnessed before. Imagine this: 100 tons of watermelons buried deep under the blazing sands of the Sahel. Not weapons. Not machines. Not foreign fertilizer shipments. But watermelons, the same fruit you enjoy at summer picnics, lowered into shallow pits until the desert swallowed them whole. At first glance, it seemed insane. Why would a nation facing hunger bury food? Why waste a fruit so rich in sweetness and water in a land desperate for life? The outside world mocked the move. Headlines joked, "Burkina Faso buries its breakfast." Critics called it wasteful, even sabotage. But to President Ibrahim Traoré and his people, this wasn't desperation. It was defiance. They called it Project Oasis. Every watermelon buried wasn't a meal lost, it was a seed of independence. Because in the Sahel, a watermelon isn't just food. It's nature's water tank, 90% water, full of minerals, carbon, and fiber. Buried in the right way, those melons turn into underground reservoirs, feeding microbes, restoring soil, and teaching barren land how to hold water again. This is why Project Oasis matters. It isn't just about crops. It's about rewriting the rules of survival. It's about rejecting dependency and proving that solutions, no matter how strange, can work. What looks ridiculous today may be remembered tomorrow as the moment the desert began to breathe again. For decades, Burkina Faso's fields have relied on foreign fertilizer shipments, late, overpriced, and tied to hidden political strings. If the trucks didn't arrive, families starved. Sovereignty was reduced to signatures on papers written in distant capitals. President Traoré wanted to break that cycle. So why watermelons? Because in a desert, the first enemy is always dryness. Fertilizers can't create water. But a watermelon can release it slowly as it decomposes. It feeds soil microbes, adds carbon that acts like a sponge, and helps seedlings survive. Local scientists tested it. Fields with buried melons held moisture for 2 weeks longer than those without. Crops like millet and sorghum sprouted faster, grew deeper roots, and even long-gone soil organisms started to return. What looked like waste was actually a low-tech, homegrown innovation. Instead of begging for imports, Burkina Faso was turning spoiled or unsold melons into living reservoirs. A burden became an asset. Yes, there were critics, concerns about pests, limited supply, uneven nutrient spread. But supporters argued the point wasn't to make melons the only solution. It was to prove a principle: Africa can transform its own resources instead of waiting for permission from abroad. As Traoré said bluntly in a national address, "If the world will not sell us fertilizers without chains, we will make our own fertility from what the earth gives us." Project Oasis is more than agriculture, it's a manifesto. A statement that survival doesn't always require imports, but imagination. The laughter of the world is slowly turning into unease. Because if the Sahel can feed itself with fruit once left to rot, what does that mean for the industries that profit from Africa's dependency? And so the question grows, if a watermelon can help revive the desert, what else is possible? Mangoes? Citrus peels? Crop residues? Could the Sahel become a living laboratory of resilience? What began with buried melons may become the spark of a new revolution, one where the desert itself learns to bloom again. Children laughed and clapped as each green melon disappeared into the pits, chanting playful songs about planting water. For the elders, the scene felt familiar. They remembered old traditions where offerings of milk or grain were buried in the earth to call for rain. To them, Project Oasis wasn't just science, it was ritual reborn, ancient customs dressed in modern form. But not everyone was impressed. In the bustling markets of Ouagadougou, vendors were furious. They argued that those melons could have been sold cheaply to families in the city. Some mothers called into radio shows asking, "How can we bury food when our children sleep hungry?" The debate split the nation in two. Some saw the project as reckless waste, others as visionary courage. The government tried to calm people by explaining that most of the melons were already spoiled or unsellable. But the image of truckloads of green fruit being swallowed by the desert was enough to spark heated arguments in mosques, classrooms, and village squares. Then came reveal number 3. 2 weeks later, test plots where melons had been buried showed something remarkable. Tiny shoots of millet and cowpeas pushed through soil that had been lifeless for years. Farmers touched the earth with wonder, it felt alive again. The results didn't silence all critics, but they shifted the mood. For the first time, Project Oasis had something undeniable, green life sprouting from dust. Word spread beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, radio shows buzzed with debates. Callers asked whether baobab pulp, peanut shells, or millet husks could be used in the same way. In Niger, agricultural students organized forums, calling it Science of the Poor, by the Poor. In Chad, community leaders praised the symbolism, if Burkina Faso can plant water, maybe we can plant hope. The laughter of outsiders was drowned out by curiosity across the Sahel. Farmers crossed borders to see it with their own eyes. Cooperatives asked if they could copy the model. What began as a local experiment was turning into a regional movement about dignity and self-reliance. But international media saw it differently. French newspapers mocked the effort with cartoons of villagers throwing fruit at sand. TV anchors in London called it a desperate stunt. American analysts dismissed it as unscientific and unsustainable. To the Western press, it was easy ridicule Africans burying fruit in the desert. Elsewhere, the tone was completely different. Russian broadcasters praised Traoré for defying dependency, comparing it to their own history of surviving sanctions. Chinese agricultural journals hailed it as a brilliant example of recycling organic waste. Turkish outlets framed it as a dignified, tradition-rooted solution. The divide was stark. To some, Project Oasis was failure. To others, it was freedom. And within that divide lay the real question, who gets to decide what progress looks like in Africa? Back home, debates only grew louder. Opposition politicians called the project a show. Civil groups demanded transparency. But in villages, people kept digging. Soldiers and schoolchildren worked side by side lowering melons into the sand. For them, it wasn't just science or politics, it was participation, a chance to take survival into their own hands. The sprouts that emerged became more than crops, they became symbols. Signs that maybe the desert could be reversed, that hunger wasn't permanent, that sovereignty could grow from something as simple as a watermelon. But the green shoots also raised red flags in powerful capitals abroad. For every sprout in the Sahel, alarms went off in the boardrooms of fertilizer companies and donor agencies. Because if Project Oasis worked, it wouldn't just change the soil, it would change the balance of power. Then came the cliffhanger. A leak. One evening, an internal memo appeared online, supposedly from a European Agricultural Trade Association. The words were blunt, almost panicked. It warned that if Burkina Faso's experiment succeeded, demand for imported fertilizers across West Africa could collapse. Billions in annual revenue were at risk. Contracts, supply chains, influence, decades of control could unravel. All because of fruit buried in sand. And the memo didn't stop there. It laid out a strategy: discredit the science, amplify stories of waste, frame the project as reckless. It urged media partners to highlight images of hungry children beside buried melons to stir outrage and ridicule. The goal wasn't to debate, it was to kill the idea before it spread. Within days, international headlines began to shift. The mocking cartoons gave way to harsher accusations. Western op-eds called Project Oasis a fraud, a cover for corruption, even propaganda. Some claimed it was hiding failures in food distribution. Others alleged shadowy deals to destabilize fertilizer markets. Inside Burkina Faso, the leak landed like thunder. Radio hosts read the memo word for word. Villagers who had just begun to believe wondered if they had been tricked. Opposition leaders demanded inquiries. Protesters filled the streets of Ouagadougou holding signs, "Where is our food? Where is the truth?" But for many citizens, the memo had the opposite effect. If powerful industries were this afraid, maybe the melons really were dangerous not to the people, but to those who profited from their dependency. On social media, a wave of memes erupted: watermelon smashing chains, melons breaking padlocks, melons as symbols of freedom. Project Oasis was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a battle over who controls the future. Fear and doubt filled the air. Was Project Oasis a bold act of sovereignty, or just a dangerous illusion? Were those green sprouts a genuine promise of renewal, or a staged performance for the cameras? The leaked memo had raised more questions than answers. And that became the cliffhanger. Just as the Sahel began to taste hope, the world's most powerful voices moved to crush it. Suddenly, the debate wasn't about melons or soil anymore. It was about survival in a world where even watermelons could threaten empires. The storm of doubt could have buried Project Oasis for good. But then came the payoff, the moment when evidence stepped out of the ground and silenced the noise, at least for a while. Independent scientists, invited to observe the test plots, published their findings. And the results were impossible to ignore. In the pits treated with melons, soil moisture remained measurable after 14 days without rain. In control plots, it was gone after just 4. Millet seedlings sprouted faster, their roots almost twice as deep by the 3rd week. Microbial activity rose by 35%, proof that life was returning to the soil. These were not miracles. But they were undeniable. The government acted quickly. Ministers held press conferences, showing photographs side by side: barren dust in one frame, fragile green shoots in the other. Their message was calm but firm: this is not theater. This is science, measured in roots and moisture, not rumors. The response inside Burkina Faso was electric. Citizens who had doubted felt pride return. For the first time in years, people saw evidence that their soil, long written off as dead, could breathe again. But the backlash outside was just as swift. Fertilizer lobbyists dismissed the results as small-scale illusions. A handful of plots does not feed a nation, one headline scoffed. Think tanks warned the approach was unsustainable, supply was limited, decomposition unpredictable. Burkina Faso pushed back. Officials explained that the point was never to replace fertilizers with melons, it was to prove a principle: that local resources, long dismissed as waste, could be transformed into tools of survival. Melons were only the beginning. Mango peels, citrus rinds, groundnut shells each could be part of the arsenal. The principle was simple: stop importing dependency, start planting resilience. That was reveal number 4. Project Oasis wasn't about melons alone. It was about rewriting the agricultural script of the Sahel itself.